So we're all going to project because we're all confident that we can speak loudly enough for you to hear us, so please put your hand up, especially at the back if you can't hear us. So for those of you that were not at the Ignite talk last night when we introduced the talk, I'm just going to go through a few slides to set the stage for this session, and then I'm also going to introduce our speakers, and then the speakers will then go in turn. Each talk's going to be about 20 minutes, 15 to 20, and then we'll have a good 15 minutes at least at the end for a conversation. So firstly, thank you all very much for coming. So this session is specifically looking at mapping hazard and risk, and that's generally with the notion that we feel quite strongly, at least the panel feel quite strongly, that hazard and risk mapping is really quite critical to mitigating the risk. So we really need to define and map the extent of risk to fully understand who all is vulnerable to that risk, and then also understand the magnitude and the frequency of the hazards. And then if we're in a sometimes luxurious situation where we can bring in information about the vulnerability of various infrastructure and people at risk, then we can start to generate a risk map. Once we have that information, then we can start to do a much better job of things such as better land use planning, developing appropriate response, including evacuation for folks to whether the hazard is a flood or an earthquake or whatever. But the mapping component is really critical, and we won't go into it today, but we sort of had a preamble at the Ignite last night, which set the scene for doing this sort of work in Africa. So this community of which you're now all a part, understanding risk, is considerably focused on risk in developing countries. The theme for this session, for this conference, in fact, is largely focusing in on the United States and specifically the Front Range of Colorado. So the point that we made last night was that often in data-poor areas of the globe, this can be a real challenge. But as we found out with the Boulder floods, even in our developed community with lots of data, lots of smart scientists, lots of great engineers, and people willing to provide really sophisticated cutting-edge data on hand, this still was not a trivial exercise, both in terms of the response to the flood and then also the subsequent recovery efforts. So thematically, at least, we're going to sort of cover a number of different case studies that relate to the Front Range flood of 2013, but we'll also go off in slightly different tangents to examples of, for example, the earthquake up in Nepal. So, just to test the technology here. So, we're really quite data rich in the United States, and we've got Craig Jacobson from Icon Engineering who's going to outline both the information that we have specifically for flood, hazard and risk assessment, and how that's really not just supported the National Flood Insurance Program, which is where all the mapping sort of evolved from there, the creation of flood insurance rate maps, the delineation of the 100-year floodplain services, which now are sort of pretty old school, but that information has provided a foundation for much more sophisticated hazard and risk mapping and development of decision support products, actually, that utilize that information and then build on that and give folks that are assessing hazard and risk tools and data to start looking at far more than just the extent of the 100-year flood. So Craig is going to look at that in some detail. And Craig has brought along Ed Dennis from his team with Icon. Ed is a geospatial science and development manager, so he's probably responsible for a lot of the cool things that you're going to see as they get into their tool. I'll have Craig tell you a little bit more about Icon Engineering, but Icon have been very involved in a lot of the front range recovery efforts. I'm sure a lot of the examples they will pull on will help you see that. Interestingly, Craig shared with me earlier that he was actually involved in a flood mapping project just a few hundred meters south of here, so we might even get some sense of what the hazard is right on the location that we're standing. So ESRI, which are a very generous sponsor of the UR meeting that we're all attending right now, is represented by Jeff Branney, and Jeff's going to talk a lot about some of the great enhancements and advancements that the Environmental Systems Research Institute group and company have made over the last several years regarding hazard and risk assessment and modeling and mapping. He's going to introduce us to some of the cutting-edge technologies for multi-hazards, not just flood, and how they might be used. And then I might be able to chip in if we've got time and elaborate on some of the tools that we use from Esri, particularly data models and data and modeling tools that help us use some of the Corps of Engineers models that we use on a daily basis for flood hazard modeling. So that's Jeff. He's his title is the technical lead for Esri. So he's got a technical and a sales role, and is also very involved in Jeff and Esri's response to hazards. So Esri have a unit that actually get up and do real work during a hazardous event, an emergency event rather. And Jeff played a significant role in the Colorado Front Range event, as well as I'm sure other events that have been going on in the last few years. So as we've now moved several months, years past the 2013 flood, we're all in a sort of recovery phase now, which is really thinking about longer term planning. And we've got a colleague from Colorado State University, Joel Schultes, who's going to talk about aspects of watershed planning, particularly focused on the channels. So here now we're not so interested in flood hazard per se, we're interested in the ability of the channel to respond and return to some sort of dynamic equilibrium so that the channel remains stable and the community that are living alongside the channel remains safe decades out into the future. And this involves a lot of geomorphic modeling work and assessment and mapping that ultimately informs that response and recovery process, and also informs the design process. So that as we restore our streams, you're seeing a lot of yellow machinery alongside rivers and ditches all up and down the Front Range, strengthening rivers, then some of Joel's work feeds into how we can do that in a more thoughtful and sustainable and resilient way. So here's Joel. He's just finished up his PhD at Colorado State University. Even before then, he was already getting very engaged with a number of the activities going on post-flood. He's part of a very important team which is now looking at not just flood response, but geomorphic response, and coming up with some modeling tools and mapping technologies and methodologies that will enable us to look at things such as debris flows, which were particularly prevalent during the 2013 event. And in actual fact, were probably much more important than flood per se in terms of the impacts that that had on communities and infrastructure. And then finally, Vicky from Digital Globe is going to talk to us about the utility of synoptic information. So we're in an era now, thankfully, where there is a wide variety of highly detailed both spatial and temporal information available to us to both use during the event, and that's where the utility of the temporal capabilities comes in, but also very spatially detailed, so that we can see in great detail what the impacts are on the ground, and also what perhaps some of the response and recovery is or how that's being handled during and after the event. So that's Vicky's bio just briefly there. She's got a very important role with Digital Globe, and she's supported by two of her colleagues that are here today, and they're going to be available for the Q&A session. So, without any further ado, we'll get moving. So we've got one presentation that's going to be based in a browser, we've got one presentation PDF, and a couple of PowerPoints. So we'll be moving around a little bit here. And the first one is Craig from Icon. I'm going to hand over to you guys.
We're even trying some new technology ourselves in terms of how we're doing the presentation, by the way that it rolls into the integrated web browser in combination with the presentation. So what we're going to, again, my name is Craig Jacobson. I'm with Icon Engineering, and I'll talk about Icon here in a second, but I want to introduce Evan Dennis as well. Evan is here from Icon as well, and he is, yes, mastermind behind a lot of the graphics that you're going to see here today. Graham, thanks for the pictures and the introduction. I was questioning even where I still have that picture, but I'm actually at the same time going, boy, it'd be nice to be on that sailboat right now. So thanks for that. But what we're going to do is we are going to talk a lot about more of the traditional flood mapping processes, and we're going to lead that into a case study here in Boulder. Not exactly the study Graham alluded to on Skunk Creek, which is the basin. Actually, we're in that basin, and it's immediately to the south of here. But we're going to talk about an area called 2 Mile Canyon Creek, but 2 Mile Canyon Creek, that was a study we had going on both before and after the floods, and it's a real good case study in just talking about how some of the limitations and where the traditional flood mapping processes kind of leave some holes. And we'll go through that a little bit here as well. And I can say from where we're sitting right now, I'd love to say I'm confident that there's not much flood risk. It doesn't seem like there's much drainage around here, but yeah, it is part of a floodplain network that does surround this area as well. I think we're good here today, though. So Icon Engineering, we are stormwater and floodplain management specialists. We're a firm of about 23 people. We're located in Centennial, Colorado, just a short ways south of here. Our specialty deals in working with floodplains, floodplain modeling and mapping, hydraulic analysis, and the full range of master planning through design processes that's associated with that. Again, we're based in Centennial, which is just south of Denver. Our clientele covers Colorado and really a focus on the Front Range municipalities. We are consultants both to the city of Boulder here as well as the University of Colorado at the same time. So that's kind of given us a unique perspective working in and out of Boulder. As Graham said, I think when the floods hit in 2013, we've been very busy and still kind of waiting on some downtimes at this point in time. It's been a very active time. Another unique aspect with our particular firm is our involvement in FEMA mapping protocol. It goes all the way back to our work directly with FEMA, as well as the Colorado Water Conservation Board here in Colorado. But we also work for a group called the Urban Drainage and Flood Control District. And Urban Drainage has a unique arrangement with FEMA that whenever somebody's coming in to propose mapping changes to the FEMA flood maps, they do all the technical review and all the technical processing for those as if they're like FEMA. And we've been their consultant doing that work since 2001. Part of that process, we've reviewed and processed well over 400 studies and cases with that particular program. So had a lot of experience working in that world. Again, these are just our bios here. I think we've covered that quite a bit. Every time I look at the years, it keeps adding up there, but I guess that's okay. And Evan is here with his self-proclaimed nerd aspect, I guess, of everything there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the National Flood Insurance Program. Is everybody generally familiar with what I'll always call the NFIP and how that relates to this? Well, it's basically been a voluntary program that's based on an agreement between the federal government and the local community. So to make this a successful program, everybody's essentially got to work together. And in exchange for adopting and enforcing the floodplain management regulations that come with being part of the NFIP program, well, federally backed flood insurance is made available. And why is that important? Well, just about every mortgage on a home that's taken out needs to be backed by this particular program. And so as a consequence, being engaged in this program has a big effect on what's happening within the local communities and expenses that go to that. So just a couple quick dates. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but the National Flood Insurance Act was essentially what started this program back in 1968, and the whole goal here was to really transfer the costs and the burden from the general taxpayers in the nation to those that are located within flood zones. So the goal here is to provide financial aid, identify flood hazards, and begin the first process in guiding people away from being located in these flood zones. There's a number of acts that have followed this that have essentially modified and changed over a period of time, such as in 1973. What was happening and then is that you basically, this was communities needed a little bit more incentive to join. So in 1973, there was more encouragement made for participation, and that's where flood insurance or federally backed loans came into play. And you can see by this chart here, just the large jump in community participation from 1968 into that 1973 and that 73 realm. Since then, there's been some reform acts, such as the 1994 National Flood Insurance Reform Act, where basically it strengthened the mandatory purchase requirements and provided some mitigation grants. And I think probably many of you have heard about the Bigger Waters Reform Act in 2012 and subsequently the HFIA Affordability Act in 2014. The goals between these programs are to really put an end to some of the subsidy rates that are out there right now that are going on some of these older properties, and start to look at watershed mapping on a flood mapping on a watershed basis. So I think the big takeaway from the National Flood Insurance Program is it's not a singular act. It really combines this effort between flood mapping, insurance, and regulations, because they all come into play what the communities are regulating to and what's being depicted on the maps in itself. So there's different components of these flood maps. You may have heard of a flood insurance study report. This is more of the technical report that goes behind the maps that you're seeing, but this is where you can get a background in terms of the flood history, what sort of analyses went into preparing these documents, and an idea of what your flood profiles are and the discharges that were used and being regulated to, and just some general information about the mapping discussions. What you're probably more familiar with is the flood insurance rate maps, and these are where you really get the depiction of the flood inundation limits that are estimated from here. And one thing that's so important to note is there are different zones that are designated on these maps, and we'll talk about those as we go through our presentation, but they're flood insurance zones. So the main purpose are, yes, it identifies regulatory requirements to it, but the different categories that are put in place deal directly with a lot of the how individual structures and buildings are rated from an insurance standpoint within these zones as well. So it's real important to really grasp the understanding of what was the initial basis for this. And of course, from a floodplain management perspective, you'll be able to identify flood elevations and more information on the technical side, such as hydraulic cross-sections and background for the topographic data. The basis of regulation that comes into play from a FEMA flood map is what we call the 1% annual chance flood. That's synonymous with more of an old school term as the 100-year flood. But 1% annual chance means, I always describe it as if you take a bag of marbles, you have one red marble and with a bunch of black marbles, and I should say one red marble and with 99 black marbles. Each and every year you have a 1% chance of pulling out that red marble. Now you put that red marble back in this bag every single year and you can pull it out. So if you found the one red marble in 2013, it doesn't mean that red marble is not going to come back up in 2015. It just has a lesser of a probability of that happening. FEMA also uses what they would call a floodway, and the floodway is used that more for regulation purposes. And that's a theoretical boundary that's used to define an area within a flood zone that should remain open for flood conveyance. And basically, I guess I always like reading the definition, means the channel of a river or watercourse in the adjacent lands that must be reserved in order to discharge the base flood. That's the same thing as the 100-year flood without cumulatively increasing the water surface elevation more than 1 foot. So this is kind of FEMA's compromise with the development world that says, okay, if you stay out of this floodway, we can allow some development within the floodplain areas. But this would be a much more restrictive zone that would take a lot more effort from a regulation and management perspective. So what goes into these flood maps is a wide array of information. This is where more the technical side comes in. You're going to be working with topography, aerial mapping, more common as LiDAR these days, sometimes some supplemental survey, hydrology. So what is hydrology? That's the amount of water that could pass an individual point at a specific time. And what we refer to as hydraulics, that deals more with the surface and the roughness and the characteristics that are going to change this path of the floodplain. And we're going to go through a little demonstration here, just in terms of how all these aspects fit together.
Okay, so this is, so we did a physical map revision for about half of Douglas County, probably half the panels. It's in its final stages right now. It's about to go effective here in March of 2016. So this is one of the outreach tools that we use. Basically just showing, and this is all open source based leaflet map box, all based on that. So it's showing what this map is actually used for, is showing changes from the effective mapping to what we're going to be showing as carpet mapping. And I don't know what else to do.
Well, I want to show the relationship of, so we talked about hydrology and hydraulics. So for an example such as this, you would have a single point of flow that would pass a given point in time. What we would use from a technical standpoint are these green lines, and those would be the cross sections on the topography, and that's used to define what these water surface elevations are, as that's what all the numbers are on top of here as well. And so all of this kind of comes into play to produce these FEMA flood maps from that.
Okay, and then also, so this is a little closer look at the actual firm panels. So this is the new standard. Instead of the old black and white ones, they changed the color a couple years ago. So these are the legible versions, which, as you can see, are still, it's still kind of iffy on whether that's actually legible or not, but it's better than it used to be. So also, along with this, they actually released the NFHL, the National Flood Hazard Layer, as a web mapping service. So that's free to grab as well. So here's an example of that. So all the different layers that you can pull in, flood hazard areas, lines, stream center lines, profile baselines, your cross sections, your VFEs, you can throw all those into there as well. Again, this is all open source. This is all lethal based here. And then I think Craig will go over that.
Yeah, I wanted to spend some time. So I talked about the different zones, and so what you're seeing up on this map is a depiction of the 1% annual chance flood, also the 0.2% annual chance flood. That's more synonymous with the 500-year event. You've also got areas that are designated as this crosshatch is an area protected by a levee system that runs through here. So each of these zones have a different, it's a great tool for floodplain management regulations because you can really see the blue here and say, those are the zones that I need to regulate to the FEMA regulations and criteria. You have the red crosshatch here, which is the floodway area, so you quickly be able to identify that's areas that are more high hazard and we need to stay out of those. But then you have variations. You might see a zone AE, that would be a more prototypical floodplain mapping elevation. A zone AO that's shown up here in the corner is an area that's, sorry, I'm doing this sideways, it's not working very well, but it's less defined, it's shallow flooding. And so that would be a zone that has some flood risk, but only to a much lesser degree as the other extents, or a shallower degree. And then the areas of orange would be what they would call their 500-year flooding. And so it's a useful tool from that perspective, but it has its limitations as well because it's looking at a single point in time. And I think that's where. So from a limitation standpoint, like I discussed, we have topography, and topography deals with age, level of detail, and that it's fixed in time. And so a lot of these maps are based on old information, and they don't really present current topography that's out there. Like Graham was talking about, during floods, things change. You have erosion, you have deposition. That's going to change everything that's built into these maps. And so there is a little bit of a strong limitation from that perspective. From a hydrology end, so this next slide represents what actually happened in 2013. This also goes back to our 2 Mile Canyon Creek example. But what you can see here is these lines here would represent what would be a prototypical design flood used for a FEMA map. What it's showing is the intensity of rain and the length of time that it would occur in, but the volume of the storm would only be what's underneath this little black line here. What happened during the 2013 flood is it was much more irregular than that, and it was drawn out, and instead of being drawn out over 30 minutes, it was drawn out over 3 days. So there was a much higher volume of water that came along with that information. And so it might not have been as intense as these design storms are, but it has more volume. And so there's just a little bit of discrepancy between what would happen during a flood and what's actually, what happened in 2013 versus how a lot of these FEMA maps are assumed. It's really interesting, if you look at this map, the total rainfall that's assumed in a theoretical 100-year storm is about 3 inches of rain. And that's what this line represents. What happened in 2013 is we had over 10 inches of rain as part of that information. What happens if you have a dam or a detention pond that relies on a certain volume of water to protect downstream properties against a flood such as that? It's going to fill up and it's going to overtop, and the level of safety that's inferred from that may be up. Okay. So hydraulics has the same limitations from that perspective. You have vegetation and aggradation and erosion and debris that have the potential to change these features real time that are going along with that. Same with man-made responses. A lot of times during these floods, people were out there sandbagging. People were out there trying to protect their property. All of a sudden, that changes some of the response that we would have as part of that as well. So I'll quickly go through this example on 2 Mile Canyon Creek. This is about a mile north of where we are right now. It's actually an area that 2 people died in. The success and kind of the failures of 2 Mile Canyon Creek is this is a study we started back in 2011. We actually presented this 2 years, or we started working on it 2 years before the flood. We quickly knew from this particular study that, you want to read the area? that because of the nature of the topography and the urbanization within this watershed, this original FEMA floodplain that was depicted there just didn't match. The topography is much more widespread. It's alluvial in nature. So we came in real quickly, used a two-dimensional analysis, which you can see here, to try to identify really where the water would go. Put the effective back on there. And you can really tell how different that is in terms of the extent of this flood. That, and really what we were finding is towards the bottom end, not much of the water ended up there at all because of the different surfaces there. Well, we presented this in early 2013 and presented it to the Water Resources Advisory Board and the public, and we really got, I'll say, hammered more or less because it was just so different. It was so technical. It was so unimaginable from a public's perception that water could go in these particular directions. And ultimately, we were waiting on new topography that the city was generating, and it got tabled in terms of getting that information being developed. What happened was the floods happened. And as you can see in the green lines here, that's the extent of flooding that came after the flood. And you can see how different that is from what was actually shown by that FEMA floodplain maps as well. So then, so I guess this is ultimately what the new maps are looking like. This is currently being reviewed by FEMA as we sit right now. It's a little bit more similar, a lot more similar to what happened during the flood. It uses FEMA zones in order to help add some resiliency in this, in order to identify flood risk throughout the watershed, because as we found there, it could be quite extensive. But it was a great lesson learned, and the failure is, I wish, as an engineer, I was able to present. I was glad I presented the information to the public beforehand. I wish I was able to gain more support on that end. The success from a technical side made us feel like from a technical end, we were really able to grasp what was going on here. And I think we have one slide left I'm going to show it. But yeah, I think that's probably the end of our presentation. We'll be happy to talk about it.
That's great. I think that was a fantastic demonstration of how the hazard and risk changes with the implementation of a different model, in that case the 2D versus the 1D model, which by the way is the standard for flood mitigation mapping. So Craig, maybe if you can field one question now, and then we'll get moving, because we held things up a bit at the beginning with a technical glitch, and then I'll get Jeff set up. So answer the question. We'll get more chance at the end.
Yeah. Can you describe the resistance in Boulder to seeing some real information that you provided?
Well, prior to the flood, we didn't have real information. Prior to the flood, everything was theoretical. Everything was based on the models, based on the characteristics of the topography. This is what we believe, from our modeling standpoint, you would end up with. The resistance was, that particular area of town has, I'll admit, a lot of very smart people that are also living and located within that basin. And when you start showing flood hazards that didn't affect them, that now start to affect them, their minds are, they're wanting to make sure they're very comfortable with the information that we're showing. And because of going from, as Graham was saying, what we would call a more traditional mapping approach, a one-dimensional approach based on topography from the 1980s, going to more recent topography in the 2000s using tight grid cells and two-dimensional approach, it just was so drastically different that you just couldn't get the buy-in from that perspective. And it wasn't that we really were being questioned from a technical side. I think everybody could understand it, but it was more from that emotional and political side. That's when you're taking 300 people out of the floodplain in certain areas and putting 300 people into the floodplain in other areas, everybody just wanted to be sure. And then when the floods happened, from a technical standpoint, we actually, it was almost like getting real life data on what was very, very close to a 100-year flood in that particular case.
That's great. Thanks, Craig. Okay, we're going to move along now. We will have more time for questions at the end.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jeff Ferrani from Esri. We're just up the street in Interlaken. And originally, when Graham asked me to do this, I was really excited about being able to show you some advances and new ways of doing things with flooding with hazard and data and mapping risk. But then as I started to prepare for this talk, I started to get depressed. And hopefully there's some hope at the end, and I'll kind of explain that as we go through here. So I wanted to kind of level set first. Why do we do this? Why is mapping hazard and risk so important? Well, we want to prevent things like this, right? We want to keep people safe. We want to keep people, out of harm's way. This is a photo from Jamestown during the flood. I mean, the promise of GIS and mapping hazard and risk really is the foundation, can really help anchor and frame emergency management programs and keep people safe. I wanted to kind of go back and think about, all right, and I stole this slide from the 90s and said, what are the foundational elements of GIS? If we think about it, think how far we've progressed in 4 out of these 5 areas, right? We no longer have floppy disks as shown there. Software has evolved, tremendously with leaps and bounds. Hardware, I mean, our phones now have more power than those Cray computers that were on display at NCAR. Data, a tremendous amount of data that's available now. I mean, all the elevation data that's available with LiDAR here locally as a result of the floods, remote sensing data from spy satellites. Just think about how far we've come over the past 25 years. Even in developing parts of the world with OpenStreetMap and the elevation data provided by the shuttle topology missions. The methods, we heard from the engineering side, the science side, how far that's evolved. So maybe you figured out now my depressing part, the people. I still think with hazard mapping, there's really, that hasn't evolved as far as it really can. There's all this great work that's been done, but I think it's not really driven as far as it can be from a leadership perspective. Things like the FEMA flood mapping. I mean, that's the basis of a lot of things, but what about some of those other areas? So that was my kind of depressing part as I kind of came through this, and I think that's the opportunity that technology has to really kind of evolve and move beyond that. You think of a typical emergency management org chart. Where does mapping hazard and risk fall? Right, probably mitigation for the most part. That's not the sexy part of emergency management. That's the hard part of doing the science. And if we think about it, today's world, there's many different players that factor in there. Commercial, insurance, public works, especially thinking about things like El Nino and how you'd respond, like the debris flows you saw in California last week. Academia, utilities, NGOs, all kind of part of the equation. So, my GIS mind wants to go and find where all this great data is. So we look to these natural hazard mitigation plans, but I can't get the data out of the PDF document or the paper map. It's not really, kind of operationalized. So I think that's, one kind of key opportunity is to pull some of that information out and operationalize it in really easy to use things. There we go. So just a little animation of just seeing through the story map journal. Now we can get some of these things out into people's hands and start to look at some of that information that's locked up in those natural hazard mitigation plans. You're just being to flip through the pages and interact with these maps and get access to that information that may be locked up in some of those places. So just from the technology and the cloud computing, we have a lot of capabilities to lift that information out of where it lives. Maybe that natural hazard mitigation plans have become a check in the box for some people and don't really kind of see all the value of the science and the hard work that the engineering firms and contractors go through to put these together. If we think about things from kind of an analytical perspective, things have come pretty far. So in this example, it's taking some of Dr. Susan Cutter's work for looking at hazard vulnerability mapping, even looking at it at a whole scale. So basically inventorying all of our natural and technological hazards, being able to look where all these things are, but then more importantly from an analytic perspective, take all these elements from drought, flooding, hazardous material routes, all these things that are potential hazards in a jurisdiction, and basically now start to combine some of those things together. People are trying to do this at a local level. This is an example of doing it at a national level, where all those hazards intersect, and now we're able to take that and intersect that with values data. Where are things that we care about, and get the results. So, the technology has evolved, pretty far to take, those weighted overlays or GIS tools that may be traditionally done in a desktop environment and make them, not only the analysis itself, but the results, and make those more accessible to be able to make priority decisions, like that house we saw earlier. Where do I need to mitigate in my, jurisdiction? And this is kind of at a national scale. One other kind of trend that I wanted to kind of highlight is how, if we think about it, so if we're going to operationalize some of this information, how can we start to get that out? And we're starting to see a trend of emergency management agencies trying to use the technology to educate the public on where they might see, risk. So we've got a big example, the state of Colorado invested in having, where's my wildfire risk? You just type in your address and get a sense of, what your wildfire risk is. The state of North Carolina has been doing some great work to even look at this in a building by building perspective and say, what are the hazards that may impact this particular building and this particular county, and give a sense of that. We've seen more know your zone type of applications where the public can go and find out for themselves what their risk may be. So it's great that this is happening, but I wonder how often it really happens, right? Maybe when you move in, maybe you're going into an area, the motivation may not be there for looking at these types of things. The state of Colorado is looking to stand up something similar. So, that's why it's so important to get that information out of those hazard mitigation plans to be able to share it. Another, key aspect that's changing is the ability for people to understand impact. So this is one of the map templates that we have that's available. It's called the Impact Summary Map. And you're able to basically, instead of doing this analysis on the desktop, leverage cloud computing and cloud data to be able to say what's the impact for a particular event. This is a really transformational map for the state of California. Just an hour or two after the Napa earthquake, one of our analysts quickly put together this application that showed the potential impact of the Napa earthquake. And decision makers could get a sense of who's impacted, the population, and what's impacted. So really quickly, at the front end of the disaster, start to get a sense of what's the potential impact of this potential event. So another key thing here is really that the bar has been lowered from a GIS perspective. You don't have to be, a GIS geek in the back room with your big computer and all your data on a brick to be able to do this analysis. It lowers the barrier, and many people can now do this type of analysis just right on the web without having to have all the data prepared and everything lined up. It's pretty quick in a few minutes. So this is really kind of transformational in the way that we can start to look at things in real time. Even seen FEMA, kind of transition from, things like HAZUS that take a long time to run and, are generally done in preparedness mitigation phase. Now this can be operationalized, and accessed, during response. And this really kind of came through in Hurricane Sandy and being able to get a sense of what's the potential impact across the East Coast and basically operationalizing some of the key modeling data that's available. Here's a quick screen snapshot from even Hurricane Patricia last night, just really quickly generated by some of our folks to see the impact. Certainly opportunities from a flood planning perspective. You do all the great engineering work to see what's impacted, but then how can you convince the public of what are some of the things that they need to do? And then also, how can we start to operationalize some of that information into real-time plans? So even just being able to take things in a three-dimensional environment, gives people more, perspective. So again, just the results of some of the hydrologic modeling from ArcHydro, presenting the results now here on the web to give people a sense of the overall impact in their community. Maybe it's something that they can relate to more. I'm getting short on time here. One last thing that I wanted to kind of share is, I think one of the technology is heading. So this is
Cat Manager. And this
I forgot to hit mute. Sorry, so we'll just look at the screen snapshot of this. So this is the results of geoplanning for the Nepal earthquake. So some of our folks were working with the ICIMOD there, and they've been able to look at the new hazards that were created as a result of the earthquake. So there's a new fault line that was discovered there. And now how are they going to rebuild some of these mountain communities and look at alternatives and planning from kind of a geodesign perspective. And this is really the promise that, Esri and GIS was built on, 45, 50 years ago is really just now kind of coming to fruition with geodesign and those kind of, geodesign goals that were set many years ago, with the advances in technology really coming to fruition. So a couple of points, in closing, the technology has evolved, dramatically, and the barriers to entry have been lowered through the power of the cloud and software as a service. There's a lot more that people can do. In my depressing point from the beginning, asking, has policy and leadership really, and the people part, really kind of kept up with the advances in technology? What are the incentives for multi-jurisdictional planning? We have things, at a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis, but how do people kind of come together now? And is mitigation the natural long-term home for this? Risk communication, operations all certainly see benefits, so maybe that there's more we can do. And then thinking about how can risk mitigation be incentivized. Home Depot doesn't say we can mitigate, how we can help you mitigate or that type of thing. They don't have that type of ad campaign. So just some things to think about. So there we go.
That's great.
Just some thoughts for this afternoon.
Thanks very much. So I think one of the most impressive things for ESRI, for me anyway, in their sort of current condition is the amount of information that they make available to users and the amount of tools that are available on the web. As an enthusiast, taking my physical science degree, probably about the same time that first graph that Jeff showed us back in the 90s, some of the work that you can now do in terms of setting up an environmental model to look at your risk for whatever hazard, in fact multiple hazards, would have been a master's dissertation back in the early 90s, and now most of us, if we're moderately technically savvy, can do this in a matter of days. So it's really supportive of the risk and hazard analysis community. So now we're going to move on to Joel, and let's get this set up. Is this right? No, it's not. I can drive for you if you want.
I'll kind of pick up the conversation about hazard mapping and talk about a specific example of this. So we've talked about inundation hazard mapping with Craig and Icon, and what I'm looking at now is related to floods. So floods obviously spread water out a lot of places, but they also move sediment. They move channel boundaries. They might find new courses. And here in Colorado, on the Front Range especially, we have a very geologically active topography. We don't have a huge amount of vegetation. We have a very flashy flow regime where we have mostly snow melt flood events, but every now and then a big rainstorm comes and causes quite a lot of dynamism in our rivers. So our rivers are very dynamic. Although we like to think of them as kind of quiet and calm and beautiful to fish in and nice to put a cabin next to, if you look at their signature in the topography around, you might see a lot of evidence of how dynamic they are. So here's the St. Vrain River. We don't have a laser. Okay. So we can see a system just south of the highway here. And it's a narrow channel. This is before the floods. But we can see kind of scroll marks. These are areas of where the river might have occupied hundreds of years ago, or perhaps thousands of years ago. These might be depressional areas that have a little more water and more vegetation. And so the rivers on the Front Range, when they kind of debouche or come out of the canyons, they transition from very steep, where they might be moving a lot of sediment during flood events, to less steep situations. And so that sediment can fall out, which causes avulsion, channels finding new routes, and often movement of the channel. So this is before the flood, just downstream of Lyons. This is after the flood events. And here's where the channel found a new course for a little while and moved a lot of sediments. Completely removed feet of sediment, deposited feet of sediment elsewhere. And I was working on, I guess, the Bing background map when we were working on ArcMap. to plot some cross sections that I just surveyed. And this was the image that I had. My cross section is down here. So what is going on? So we had to go to a different source and to find a more contemporary photo. So just zooming in of how much a river can move. There's the original channel, and essentially the meander that was up there moved hundreds of yards downstream, ate out quite a bit of these people's backyard, and there's a water treatment plant there. So this is just an example of how much rivers can move and what kind of hazards are associated, not only with inundation, but actual dynamism of rivers. So we call these fluvial hazards. And fluvial refers to something that is a process of a river. So fluvial geomorphology, something that I study, is how rivers shape the landscape. And so that's something we can study at a long-term scale, but we have these episodic, kind of really dynamic events where fluvial geomorphology is kind of wrought upon the landscape where we live. So we don't necessarily think about geomorphic hazards or these fluvial hazards. And after the 2013 floods that we experienced, it was very apparent that this is something that should be considered. So the state, probably under influence from the floodplain managers at the state level, passed a bill that funded a natural hazard mapping program. So this is updating a lot of the maps, probably funding some of the work that ICON's doing, where we are updating a lot of our maps because the rivers moved and maybe the floodplains are no longer valid. But also looking at two other types of hazards. These are geomorphic hazards. So we're looking at the fluvial hazards that I just introduced, and also debris flow hazards. So these are areas where we have steep hill slopes and a lot of debris that might accumulate over thousands of years can be released and entered into the river over a big flood event like we had. And so looking at FEMA inundation maps versus, they're called channel migration zones. This is something that came out of Washington State, which is kind of the leader in mapping these fluvial hazards. And FEMA floodplain maps, say we have a river meandering through a wide open valley, very shallow, kind of mild topography, then the floodplain might be very wide. There's a lot of area for the water to spread out, and so you might have a wide zone. The channel migration zone, or the fluvial hazard zone, which we're calling in Colorado, because we have to be special and make it unique, might be much narrower in that case, where the river might just be, the hazards associated with fluvial action on the river might just be associated with kind of lateral migration downstream, maybe one of these meanders could cut off or something like that. In a more confined setting where we have valley walls coming up, maybe these are erodible, the FEMA floodplain would be pretty narrow. But if we have homes up here, and there's some dozens of examples in our canyons in the foothills where these folks may have built their home up here, didn't think they needed flood insurance because they were way up, tens of feet above where the map floodplain might be. But the river migrated into the hill slope and undermined it, and they had all the ground underneath their homes washed away, as well as their home. So this is mapping the fluvial hazard zone, gets at these other hazards associated with rivers that are currently not mapped. And so we define it as an area a stream has occupied in recent history or could occupy, or also could physically influence. And that gets at streams migrating in and cutting into hill slopes and causing failure. And also within this definition is the idea that water moves sediment and can manipulate the boundaries of the river, especially during flood events. So there are many different processes associated with fluvial hazards. I'm summarizing them as lateral migration and widening. So this is processes of the channel moving out and moving down. Meander migration, so this is where meanders slowly migrate down valley. And this is a process that can happen incrementally over hundreds of years, or it can happen kind of very rapidly all at once during a flood event. Avulsion gets at the channel finding new routes. And in that case of lions on the St. Vrain, it took a whole other course down the valley and flooded areas that were outside of the map floodplain. And then also hill slope failures. And so fluvial hazard mapping then combines first identifying where all of these might occur in a river corridor, and combining that to create an integrative map that is the fluvial hazard map. And so part of the team that is developing this for the state, where the state wants a protocol to map the fluvial hazard zone. It's not a very straightforward thing. There are not necessarily step-by-step mechanisms that we can use to map For example, like flood inundation, we have decades of experience modeling hydrology and hydraulics, although there always are advances to be made, as indicated by looking at two-dimensional modeling. But geomorphology is kind of old school. There aren't a lot of sophisticated techniques, or there are sophisticated techniques that might not be very accurate, and would take someone to do their whole PhD to kind of look at how a channel might move over a period of time. And so we're looking for tools that are fairly rapid, that we can implement over a large area, and be conservative. So because they're rapid, we have to be fairly conservative. I don't think these maps will have they won't come into the same regulatory framework that inundation maps do, because we don't have necessarily a probability associated with this. Just a kind of a zone, perhaps a planning tool that cities and counties and homeowners might reference to understand more comprehensively what their hazard is, or vulnerability hazards. And so I'm going to talk briefly about what goes into mapping local hazard zones. First, we need a context. We need to know rivers do not behave the same all across the board. So depending on where you are within a watershed, headwaters versus maybe on the plains, depending on what the valley type is on a particular reach of interest, these influence the ability of a river to respond to a flood and what types of responses it might have. And so channel confinement is one of the things we look at. We have a confined channel, something you might see in the canyon area or in headwaters up in the mountains. Semi-confined, the channel has a bit of a floodplain, maybe there's some meandering happening. And then we have an unconfined channel, so maybe way out on the plains, maybe the South Platte River, you really don't see a picture of that. So that's one aspect of looking at approaching hazard mapping, so kind of giving a context of where the river is. Hill slope coupling, Graham alluded to thinking about debris flows and all the sediment that can enter the channel. This is something you can map given high resolution digital elevation models. This looks at how steep hill slopes are and how close they are to the channel, which can be an indication of their ability to introduce a lot of sediment, which can cause a lot of these channel changes. And then finally, slope is a very important parameter as well. So how steep is the channel? How much energy does it have to move its boundaries? Or are we going from a very steep place to a more mild place where sediment might be able to fall out? And so here's an example of mapping valley types. This is some work out of CSU, Eric Carlson, and he's mapped valley types for the Arapahoe National Forest using 10-meter DEMs. We're going to go back and do this with the LiDAR data that's available and refine some of those categories. But it's essentially looking at the level of confinement, so the width of the channel relative to the valley, and also the steepness. And so we can go then and map valley type and use this as a tool to guide our fluvial hazard mapping. Stream power is another important metric. And this gets at the discharge at a particular flood event, so maybe the 100-year flood that we're considering, in the slope, as well as the width of so how confined the water is. And so stream power, it's been studied for decades as relating stream power during flood events to geomorphic change. And so folks can map this. So this is kind of longitudinally moving down a river. We're seeing how does stream power change and how does that relate to net erosion or net deposition along the river. And so we can use this again as a mapping product and then relate it to where we've observed river change. And so this is a study I'm working on with the Forest Service and the state. We're mapping stream power on a reach scale and then relating that to severity of change and trying to come up with essentially a predictive model to say, given this type of confinement, this type of geomorphic context, and this type of flood event, where do we predict or post-dict in this case how much change could occur and what severity of change? All right, and so just some examples of how geomorphic context influence the type of change that can happen. Here we have a watershed from headwaters to mid-reaches, kind of a deltaic environment, which we don't have in Colorado, and the different types of valleys there. And just an example from the headwaters, this is the slide that Graham showed, where we have just within several hundred yards, different processes happening. We have super confined canyon reach, where we're eroding a lot of the bed, we're widening the channel into the road, as you can see there. And then it transitions to a more mild slope where a lot of the sediment comes out. And so the ability of the channel to move the sediments, the transport capacity is less than the supply. The supply drops out. And we have braiding and avulsion. So that different process happens based on this different geomorphic reach. Moving down further into the plains, this is an example. This is the South Platte River, just south of Greeley. The blue line denotes the original channel, and this is where it evolves and found a new path and cut across the highway there. So this is another thing that we might try to map, looking at where lower channels, maybe there's a historic channel that moved through here. And so putting this all together, we have, for Colorado, what we're recommending is essentially adapting a lot of the knowledge and processes from Washington State and kind of modifying it down to Colorado as best we can. So the idea is we're first delineating an active river valley. This is an area where the river has occupied or could occupy from a geomorphic perspective, but there's not necessarily a time frame associated with that. And then adding on to that, there might be some buffer associated where the river could cut into the hill slope. And so we need to identify erodible hill slopes and come up with a way to think about how far back we need to move. So just looking at that from a cross-section standpoint, maybe identify some relic channels, maybe there's a fluvial terrace. This would be sediment that has been deposited by the river in the geologic past that was susceptible to erosion. And this is what an example of the map. This is the Fall River near Estes Park, where they're using LiDAR. This tool essentially looks at LiDAR data to identify the geomorphic features. It doesn't work in areas that are highly developed or modified, so there are some weaknesses to that. So it's best applied in rural areas where there aren't development, where there could be future development. And they're identifying different areas, so we have active river valley right here. We have an avulsion zone, avulsion hazard zone based on finding maybe some of those relic channels that have existed there, and then adding a buffer to where the channel could erode into the hill slope. We can't do this level of mapping everywhere, and headwater streams, maybe below a certain drainage area threshold, like 2 square miles, for example. In these types of streams, LiDAR data is not able to get at some of these fine details. And so what we need then is just to apply a set buffer width off of that, beyond which we know the channel might be able to influence the hill slope, but this is kind of an approximation for some of these smaller streams where there might be hundreds of miles of channel that we're not going to be able to map. But note that headwater channels differ widely across the state. Here's on the western slope of Arroyo that might need much wider buffer numbers, for instance. And then finally, when you're in kind of broad open country, there's a lot of agriculture that has moved over the landscape and maybe erased some of those historic signatures of where the channel was. And there's not a valley necessarily for it to interact with because it's out on the plains. Identifying kind of the general trend of the river, this is a meander belt center line that you could trace manually, and then applying a buffer to that might be a better approach than looking for geomorphic signatures or active valley bottoms. We're reserving that more for the kind of confined and semi-confined conditions. Field verification is going to be necessary in a lot of these cases. I think that we're proposing kind of 2 levels of efforts, a phase 1 approach that creates these kind of more conservative maps, and then a rapid field verification where we look at where does bank armoring exist, where is this hill slope bedrock versus some more erodible type of material. So the idea then of mapping fluvial hazards is to comprehensively characterize hazard in the river corridor. This is in addition to inundation hazard mapping, which does not get at all the hazards associated with rivers. And then communicating this to land use planners, to property owners. The state is funding the initial efforts, and I think that's their carrot is we'll fund this if you adopt this. If a certain county, for example, would adopt this maybe into their floodplain management ordinance, or maybe just as a hazard communication tool. The idea is then to, by identifying comprehensively hazard where you could mitigate better for future floods, and they will occur. Floodplains and riparian areas are very sensitive ecologically, they're great for recreation, so there's a lot of multiple benefits here. There's a lot of challenges. For example, uncertainty. We are essentially using economic judgment to do a lot of this work because there are not any great objective tools to do this work. So as we move forward and develop and pilot this, we hope to answer some of a lot of the open-ended questions we have. It's hard to do this in developed areas. Rivers don't behave, they don't behave predictably in really any case, but at the same time, in developed areas, there's a lot of human influence that might change how a river can move. Bridges could plug, and so there's a lot of challenges and questions with developed areas, and will we actually map fluvial hazards in those? And finally, what kind of regulatory framework will this fall in at the state level? Washington State has state level hazards legislation that kind of requires certain types of mapping to happen. Colorado does not have that, so it's going to be much more of a case-by-case local adoption of this. And we talked about the people. Do people want to know that they are now in their map in the fluvial hazard zone? Is that going to cause grief and frustration? There's a great example in Utah where on the Virgin River, they created a map like this, and there was a lot of pushback. But they eventually got the Home Builders Association on board, where they wanted to be a safe community. They didn't want to be a community where we swept hazards under the rug and ignored them until they came. And so the community decided by embracing it and planning for it, they would kind of put that forward as we are a safe community and we're open for business. So I think hopefully spinning it in that way can get people to adopt it. So I'll just end by thanking my collaborators. Katie Yott and Mike Blazevich are working with me on the team developing this protocol for the state. And so they've done a lot of piloting work to put this forward. Jamie Prochnow, our liaison there with the state. Steve Yoakum with the Forest Service is part of the stream power work, as well as Ryan Bledsoe. And so we're partnering with them on looking at that question. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much, Joe. I think that's a great example of, despite all the great work that's gone in over several decades with the engineering and science that Craig introduced on the first talk, when the flood came in 2013, we realized that perhaps we're not quite as smart as we thought we were, or at least we certainly don't have the foundational mapping to move ahead. There are other things to consider, and clearly Colorado is putting, the state is putting a lot of thought into that. So I think we've got time for one quick question for Joe. Will I just get set up for Vicky? Any questions?
Well, yeah, look for your fluvial hazard map in the next couple of years. And we'll make it a CAN-Z file so you can operationalize it.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Vicki Bassett. As Graham mentioned earlier, I'm a product manager with Digital Globe, and one of the products I support is our emergency management product. So super excited to be here today to talk to you about the data component, as Jeff mentioned, of GIS. Digital Globe is a satellite imagery company. We have a constellation of 4 satellites currently just orbiting there, taking pictures all the time, everywhere. And one of our products, this first product that I'll talk about, is really focused on emergency management, ensuring people have the data they need in the wake of an emergency, but also leveraging our extensive archive to ensure you have up-to-date imagery to do some of the different mapping projects that you need to do. All right, so topic of today's discussion, clearly the Boulder floods. Digital Globe did activate First Look for the Boulder floods. Essentially what that means, we've got a team who's constantly monitoring world situations. We use multiple sources, and in this case, the news is one great way to know what's going on locally, especially. Internationally, we use a lot of international sources, but here, clearly, when we got into the office that morning and understood what the severity of the flood was, the level of devastation, we activated our First Look product. What that means to you is we began actively tasking over all of Boulder, Larimer, Weld, the counties in this area. As part of this First Look product, we pull in a bunch of data from our archives so that you can do change detection, you can do damage assessments, you can really try to understand where was this river before, where does it need to get back to, instead of just having the sort of after imagery, you have that context of before and after. Kind of case in point, Hurricane Patricia. Yesterday was a busy day, getting a lot of pre-event imagery out to like OSM, United Nations, and others, so that they could actually start doing some mapping of these coastal areas before the hurricane actually hit, just so that the change detection, the damage assessment was as accurate as it could be. So as I mentioned, first look, digital wasn't just about responding to everybody's request for satellite imagery, wherever they are in the world. First look is one of our products that is we consider a subscription product. Like I mentioned, we have a team of people who are ensuring that we have imagery over disaster events. It really is focused on the needs of our emergency management communities with current imagery base maps that can be leveraged all the time to updated imagery in the hours after an event. Essentially, as soon as the clouds clear, we do provide that imagery from before, what we call pre-event, during, as much as possible. Floods are challenging, tends to be cloudy, and certainly as soon as the clouds clear, getting imagery of the aftermath, so people can get in there and focus on response and then recovery. One thing that's telling of especially Boulder County, I mean, it is our backyard. Digital Globe is down the street. Our headquarters are in Westminster. We still have an office up here in Longmont, so this is our backyard for sure. And I was just looking this week at what coverage we've had of Boulder County. I'm sure there's people involved in ongoing recovery. There's still a lot of activity. We have imagery at least monthly. A lot of cases, every month there's like a couple images for the past 2 years. Like we just blanket this area with coverage so that we have up-to-date data to support all these tools that can really help you understand where have we gone far enough, where do we still have work to do. That's what really good. And imagery is available. We do have an online platform, so for those who, the very few who don't use Esri tools, you can come to our own platform and view it there. It's available through Esri and clearly on these other GIS tools. Now I'm going to let the imagery speak for itself, because imagery is incredibly exciting. We got lucky with the Boulder floods in a sense that, I don't know if you remember, it was obviously raining Wednesday, Thursday. We had a little bit of a break in the clouds on Friday and Saturday. So that those 2 days we have a lot of very sort of real-time imagery where the flood was at its peak in some cases, but certainly it allowed people a glimpse of what was going on, so they could get in there and actually help. This image shows the Lions from the 14th, shows the confluence of the North and South St. Vrain creeks, and you can really tell from the middle. I mean, all of the essentially the sediment-laden river and watershed just blanketing that portion of Lions. Here's an image of sort of downtown Lions, I guess. The community out there on the left by the high school clearly cut off. I mean, I think that was one of the big messages for a lot of these lines. We cut off from any access roads. Here it shows the Common Drive Bridge was out, so that community was sort of left with their primary inlet in and out route gone. Flooding is clearly evident throughout a lot of the imagery. Here's a shot kind of southwest of Lyons along the South St. Vrain Creek. Highway 7 was pretty devastated. You can kind of see the flooding. It's kind of hard, I guess, in the image. You can kind of see where it's pointed out, where the river or the road was either washed out completely in the upper left to maybe just flooded, and there was a lot of debris on the road. This sort of real-time intelligence can certainly help in knowing you know, can we get there this way? You know, is it possible to get there with Highway 7, or how do we get in and out of this area? How do we get there to help people instead of getting close and realizing we can't get through, or maybe driving on a aspect or a part of the road that maybe did get washed out underneath. You don't want to be in that area. So, you know, in talking with folks since the Boulder floods, and really understanding where we can be the most help in these types of situations, one of the common themes that I hear is certainly with a disaster, the magnitude and scale of the Boulder floods, satellite imagery is so valuable in providing the overview. You know, it's one thing to have planes up there flying around. You can see pieces. With a couple of shots on that Friday and Saturday, it really provided emergency responders in the Boulder Emergency Operations Center and the overview of the extent of the flood. And just, I mean, I didn't include it here, but we had images of the Button Rock Reservoir, so you could see it was at its max, and you know, they were starting to let water out. You know, you could see the entire front range and really get a feel for where assistance is likely needed. A couple images of Longmont, just because these images are so telling. You know, there's so much you can get from the imagery alone. I mean, we're not even talking about going in and then actually using some tools to map some of these areas. This imagery in the days following provided so much valuable information. This is the west side of Longmont over by Airport Road. Typically, the St. Vrain River, you know, I think it's kind of through the middle. It's like this tiny little channel, and on the 13th of September, it was almost a mile wide. It was basically taking over the west side of Longmont. Clearly flooding areas, these communities by the golf course, the railroad. This is as it's moving east through Longmont, flooding the fairgrounds and a lot of the businesses down in the heart of Longmont. Some more shots. Clearly you can see we're getting through the clouds here, but they're always present. Southwest of Longmont, just another shot that kind of gives a sense of what's possible with our satellite imagery. This is Little Boulder Creek running through, and it's just massive at this point, wiped out North Memphis Street due to the volume and intensity of that flood. So, conclusion for me, really we look at ourselves as a valuable data source. Certainly imagery is useful, all kinds of different sources of imagery, but satellite imagery in mapping hazards, assessing risk, mitigating risk. We're always kind of up there when a disaster does strike, so that we can provide real-time imagery after an event. And First Look really is our product that drives us to be proactive. You know, we're getting imagery so that it's available to people who need it, both throughout the year with an imagery-based map, so you can make sure that your floodplains are up to date, and you're working with current imagery, or in the wake of an event, both to do your emergency response in the days following it, but in that lengthy recovery time, ongoing updates to the imagery, so that you've got current information to work with. All right, that's it.
Thank you very much. So I think, you know, generally the entire recovery response and recovery community have a debt of gratitude to companies like Digital Globe, especially Digital Globe and Esri, for some of the data and tools that they put out during and after the event to help us all do a better job, whatever that job was. One thing that sprung to mind during Vicky's talk there was, if you remember, Craig showed us the map of how differently the flood inundation zone model. Flood inundation zone looked when he applied a two-dimensional model rather than a 1D model. So one of the very useful things of having this information from the event taken sequentially through the event is that we can then use that information to both validate and then recalibrate the details of that type of modeling and improve our floodplain analysis. and goodness only knows how many lives might have been saved during the event. I suppose it's going to be impossible for us ever to fully estimate what that was, but just people making smarter decisions because they weren't trying to cross bridges when bridges were just about to get inundated or blown out, or made sensible choices on the best way just to generally get out of town. We probably won't know, but it's almost certain that the rapid delivery of the images that we were just looking at did save lives and help people make better decisions. So we have 13 minutes or longer if you choose to stay for the Q&A session now. So we'll just open it up, and I think just direct the questions at who you would most like to point it at. Or you just may desperately need more coffee. Go ahead, sir.
This is sort of a tough question, but is it possible for the panel to go around without competing too much? Talk about the ups and downs of each in comparison of each technology that we saw, because they all sound good I'm a planner, so from a planning point of view, I could see the use for each, but as a planner, I would pick the one that would be germane to the project. So is it possible to do a short comparison, or kind of a wrap-up short comparison of the highs and lows, or the pluses and minuses of each technology?
Yeah, and I'll frame it a little bit because I think I understand where you're going with the question. But I think probably in general we won't be able to compare apples and apples across the board, but I think everybody will have some input on the technology that they've used most during the recovery period. So we might as well start with that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like maybe just because I work there, but I feel like we stand out a little bit because we really are the content provider. We certainly have an analysis team that helps assess the imagery and guide people, so they aren't looking at thousands of kilometers of imagery. We're kind of helping them pinpoint where to look, highlighting where there's relevant information in the imagery. But certainly our imagery can be leveraged by anybody. I think it's certainly a component to the tools that you'll hear more about. So yeah, I think we're kind of a provider regardless of what tools you choose to use. But certainly we also have the analytic and other capabilities to assist where that's appropriate.
Thank you.
And you asked for the opposite of the downsides?
Yeah, whatever it is.
The downsides, right? It's hard to see through clouds if the clouds are there, and for, like you said, a rain-based event, and there are going to be clouds. So it's hard to get the right windows as well. We are constrained both by the U.S. government and by physics in terms of our resolution potential. So like 1 foot resolution is our best, but we know the aerial can collect at 6-inch resolution, but oftentimes it can be more of a challenge, both logistically and financially, to activate an aerial collection, especially in emergency type response. Whereas we're circling overhead at all times. So you kind of have to weigh those factors and make a decision as to what kind of data you want to get access to. But that's why it's nice that we've actually built a team and a plan and a mechanism to monitor events that are going to be important at the national level and at the local level, and try and provide as much relevant data as possible for whoever's trying to solve problems. When we activated a first look event for Nepal, we posted all of our imagery, we posted all crowdsourced related points and everything, and just made them available on the website. And we were so surprised to see all the different groups who accessed the data and found it useful for their projects. And there's no way for us to reach out to them proactively, so the best thing we can do is just kind of post it in an available location and hope that people who need it find it and use it. Because there's really no time to do any sort of like overarching collaboration. It's just make it accessible and let people do the most they can with it.
And some of the data that we've talked about can be quite complementary. So we've mentioned LiDAR several times, which is an active sensor which will actually punch down through water vapor. So while it's not an image, we are able to generate an image with LiDAR, and that could be, for example, useful if we could see to be able to develop stage discharge relationships during the event. We could use there's somewhat irregular reflection of the LiDAR back off the surface of the water to complement the visible imagery. So I don't know if you guys have any other thoughts.
So I'd ask, given the limitations, how quickly can you guys respond? How quickly is it, can you get over a certain area on average?
Yeah, so as Tom mentioned, our satellites are orbiting at all times. They have a slightly offset orbit, so they sort of walk across the earth. But roughly about 10:30 every morning they're going overhead, and with the constellation of 4, at least one often has a view of the ground at any one time, considering some of the physics. So they might not be directly overhead, it might be over there, but it can look back over here. So like we can get you a shot every day, but as Tom mentioned, there's lots of things that you have to understand when you're talking about taking an image like that from the sky, whether it's clouds or just other collections we're looking to make. Typically, an image, though, when it gets down, we download it at one of our ground terminals, and then get it back here, get it produced and out to the platform. For first look, since it's typically emergency response, it's prioritized kind of all through the process. So it's hours that it'll get to the platform or get to somewhere where you can access it. With other imagery, it could be longer, it could be a day.
Yeah, and for my work, I'll definitely have used these images post-flood because in a lot of cases, the state responded very quickly to go back and push rivers back to where they had been. I'm interested in knowing where they moved so that we can remember that and map that. And so using these tools of on the spot when it happens is really important. And the LiDAR data that we have was flown months, maybe 6 months to a year afterwards as well. So we're not necessarily getting some of the active features from before capturing. So these tools are very helpful for me in the more longer term of thinking about modeling and studying these. As far as mapping fluvial hazard, I talked about some of it. The uncertainty associated with it is very great, and we're not going to be able to quantify it necessarily. We're trying to be conservative, creating tools that will give you a conservative look at where we think hazards could happen in kind of the current regime, current flow regime, current configuration of the river. And so these maps, I think, will be valid given kind of that qualification. And I think it's going to be important to be transparent as we develop a protocol and as we develop these reports and these maps to say, here's where we have some questions. It's not going to be like a product that we have like FEMA where it's like, here's a map and that's it. Although, of course, it goes through a review process as well. So I think having a review process would be important for this.
And I can see actually potentially, based on what you mentioned at the end there regarding the regulatory context versus Washington State, for example, where those maps can actually be enforced. The real challenge will be, regardless of the uncertainty, is how much they actually get uptaken and used.
And so speaking with planners like yourself, as we move forward with this and do these projects and do these mapping, I think it's going to be very important to have people like yourself at the table explaining what the regulatory context for this could be or would be, and so we can integrate it as best as we can.
Yeah, and I would add the same thing from flood mapping, as we were showing flood map, the traditional practices is a good first start to things to really identify some key areas to focus in on, but in terms of what we saw in the other presentations, it only can be expanded from those points in time. And as a planner, I know I've always kind of used the term best available information. You probably have a lot to focus in on, and you do have to kind of sort through all of those and determine what seems to be real, what's enforceable, number one, and that's where a lot of the regulatory approaches come in, but also from a community side of things, what makes the most sense, and that's where a lot of these other avenues are going to help you get information for you.
I think it's all aspects are important. All aspects are important. We're kind of working together. So it's kind of tough to answer your question on which one to choose, because I think all of them are, provide value. I mean, from the GIS side, kind of think of it as an integrative, aspect of trying to bring in all of these, various pictures to see, what's the current, operations picture, what's the current, risk picture, what's the current, kind of recovery picture, and there's dependencies on on all the things that we kind of, talked about today. I think, in terms of the limitations, I think it's I think it's back to the people side. It's an expectation. Come into the GIS, make me a map isn't necessarily the right question anymore. They're oftentimes in the back of the room saying, we have all the answers, what's the question? And capable of doing all these great things and bringing a lot of this together to help answer some of the real business issues that they posed.
Yeah, that's a great response. I think just generally your question, which was a great question. So I think perhaps that's the summary is what we really need is more time than this 10 minutes for us, the technologists, engineers, scientists, to sit with planners and maybe use the Esri hazard story dialogue to see what all of the potential hazards are that we might be vulnerable to, and then hear from you what are the questions you're going to need us to be able to provide you mapped information to answer, so that we can start working to develop that. I mean, frankly, the work that Joel just outlined, Washington State did this 12 years ago now, and the only reason they did it is just because they've got very dynamic gravel bed streams that whack big communities frequently. So now we've had our event and we're moving in the right direction, but it took the event to drive that process. And I guess if I've got a point here is that perhaps planners could actually do that preemptively and start us all thinking about what we might need for something that hasn't yet happened yet. Any other questions? All right, it's definitely Saturday afternoon. And because of that, I thank you all very much for coming and taking part in the session.